The unexpected encounter. In the cold, metallic corridors of the Jangar warship, Captain Polgara Shin stalked down towards the brig. His ship, a top-of-the-line battleship, was designed with precision. Every section strategically placed to optimize both offense and defense. The brig, buried deep within the ship's core, was intentionally situated far from any potential escape routes. Anyone foolish enough to attempt an escape would have to fight their way through the entire ship to find freedom. Captain Shin's mission was clear: interrogate the human prisoner captured during a recent raid on a human fleet resupply station. The thought of this particular human irritated him. The prisoner was not a warrior, lacking the muscular build and cybernetic implants found on human Marines. Instead, he was a seemingly soft individual with blonde hair and soft features, making the captain question the worth of this interrogation. As Shin approached the guarded door, the soldier stationed outside snapped to attention and quickly opened it, relieved to have a task to break the monotony. Stepping inside, Shin was greeted by a stench: body heat, sweat, and blood, an all-too-familiar scent in interrogation rooms. His neck frills shuffled slightly, the Jangar equivalent of a human sigh, signaling his readiness to begin. The human was strapped to a chair, the kind that promised nothing but pain. Blood trickled from his forehead, which caught Shin by surprise. He hadn't ordered the interrogation to start yet. His temper flared. "Guard!" Shin's voice boomed, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The soldier who had opened the door for him quickly entered, saluting with a tinge of fear in his eyes. "Did you harm the prisoner before I arrived?" Shin demanded, his voice cold and unyielding. The guard broke eye contact, guilt etched on his face. "Sir, he was insulting. I overreacted." Before the guard could continue his explanation, Shin's plasma blade was already drawn, slicing through the air with deadly precision. In an instant, the guard's arm fell to the floor with a soft thud. The guard didn't scream, merely gritted his teeth and grimaced as fluids leaked from his wound. With a nod from Shin, the guard quickly exited, clutching his severed limb, hoping to make it to the medbay in time. Shin turned his attention back to the human, whose eyes were wide with shock and fear. "I apologize for my guard's actions. You were not to be harmed before the interrogation," Shin stated, maintaining a tone of politeness even in the midst of hostility. After all, they were at war with humanity, but there was no need to abandon all manners. The human's response was unexpected. "You don't need to interrogate me at all. I'll tell you whatever you want. Just don't chop my arms off," he blurted out, his voice trembling. Shin was taken aback. This was not how interrogations with human military personnel typically went. "Why are you so eager to betray your people?" Shin asked, his curiosity piqued. The human glanced nervously at the plasma blade on Shin's belt. "I'm not trained to resist torture. You'd get the information out of me eventually. So engineers like me are taught to just tell you what you want and try to negotiate release. Can I be released?" "No," Shin replied flatly, the request denied without hesitation. The human sighed, clearly resigned to his fate. "Worth a try. So, what do you want to know so you don't cut me up?" Shin found himself intrigued by the human's straightforwardness. Perhaps this interrogation would be more fruitful than he anticipated. "To start with, tell me your name and function." The human straightened slightly in his chair, as if finding some small comfort in the routine of a proper introduction. "I'm Engineer Second Class Michael Barley. I work primarily on post-repair inspections, kind of like an intern for my crew. I spend a lot of time doing paperwork and writing reports on problems with warship construction." Shin nodded, considering his next question carefully. "Would you be able to tell me about the human forces during the Second Battle of Valhalla? Specifically, their new weapons?" Barley hesitated, glancing at Shin with a mix of fear and resolve. The room fell silent, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Would this human's cooperation lead to an unexpected alliance, or was this merely the beginning of a more complex and dangerous game? The unlikely informant. Michael Barley took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew that revealing too much could be considered treason, but he also knew the odds of survival were slim if he refused. The alien captain's demeanor was stern, yet strangely respectful, which only added to Barley's internal conflict. Could he truly trust this Jenger captain, or was this all just a trap? Shin watched as the human struggled with his decision. It was a delicate balance, offering just enough information to satisfy the alien's curiosity without giving away critical military secrets. Barley decided to tread carefully, choosing his words with precision. Well, the Second Battle of Valhalla was a turning point. Barley began, his voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at him. Our forces were significantly outnumbered, but we had developed new tactical weaponry that caught your fleets off guard. The key wasn't just the weapons themselves, but how we used them. Shin's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. Go on. Barley swallowed hard. We developed what you might call smart weaponry. Our missiles were equipped with advanced AI that allowed them to adapt in real time to battlefield conditions. They could change course, evade countermeasures, and even target weak points on your ships that traditional missiles couldn't. Shin nodded, absorbing the information. He had heard reports of the devastation caused by these weapons, but hearing it directly from a human engineer added a new layer of understanding. And what about your ship designs? We noticed a significant increase in their resilience during that battle. Barley hesitated again, knowing that this was potentially even more sensitive information. Our ships, we've integrated nanotechnology into the hulls. They can self-repair minor damage on the fly, making them much harder to take down. It's not perfect, but it saved countless lives. Shin leaned back slightly, impressed despite himself. The humans had always been resourceful, but this level of innovation was unexpected. He had to admit there was a certain respect growing within him for this species, even as they remained his enemies. As the interrogation continued, Barley found himself gradually relaxing. The more he spoke, the more he realized that Captain Shin was genuinely interested in the technical aspects of human warfare, not just in extracting secrets for immediate military gain. There was an intellectual curiosity there, a desire to understand his enemy on a deeper level. Shin, for his part, began to see Barley less as a prisoner and more as a potential ally. The human's insights were valuable, and his willingness to cooperate, albeit reluctantly, was a sign that there might be more to this war than simple conquest. Perhaps in the midst of conflict, there was room for dialogue, for understanding, even for unexpected alliances. But as the conversation flowed, both captain and engineer were keenly aware that their respective superiors would not approve of this growing camaraderie. They were supposed to be enemies, locked in a battle for survival. Yet here they were, exchanging knowledge, finding common ground in their shared passion for innovation and strategy. As the session drew to a close, Shin made a decision. "You will be moved to more comfortable quarters," he stated, much to Barley's surprise. "I believe there is more you can offer us, not just as a prisoner, but as a consultant." Barley blinked, unsure of how to respond. Was this a trick, or was the captain genuinely offering him a chance to survive, perhaps even to collaborate? Before he could formulate a reply, Shin stood up, signaling the end of the session. "Think about it, Engineer Barley. You may find that our interests are not so different after all." As Barley was escorted out of the room, his mind raced with possibilities. What had just happened? Was he truly on the path to becoming an ally of the Jenger, or was this merely another layer of the trap? One thing was certain: the days ahead would be filled with difficult choices, choices that could change the course of the war and his life forever. The reluctant collaboration. Michael Barley's new quarters were a significant upgrade from the cold, sterile cell he had been confined to. The room was modest but comfortable, with a small bed, a table, and a chair. There was even a viewport, offering a glimpse of the stars outside, a stark reminder of how far he was from home. As he settled in, his thoughts returned to the conversation with Captain Shin. The Janger had been unexpectedly civil, even respectful, but Barley couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a larger game. The offer to collaborate, to share his knowledge, was tempting, especially if it meant better treatment and a chance to survive. But it was also fraught with danger. How could he trust the enemy? And more importantly, could he trust himself not to give away too much? Days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Barley was given access to a basic terminal, allowing him to study Janger technology and ship schematics, albeit heavily restricted versions. The more he learned, the more he realized just how different the Janger were from humanity. Their technology was advanced, but rigid, lacking the adaptability and ingenuity that characterized human engineering. It was clear that they valued efficiency and precision above all else, which made their reliance on Barley's insights even more puzzling. Eventually, Captain Shin visited him again, this time in his new quarters. "I trust you've been settling in well, Engineer Barley," Shin said, his tone neutral. Barley nodded cautiously. "It's better than I expected. Thank you." Shin took a seat at the small table, gesturing for Barley to do the same. "We have a problem," he began without preamble. "Our latest offensive against the human fleet has stalled. Your people's new tactics and technology are proving to be more challenging than anticipated." Barley tensed, unsure of where this conversation was heading. Was Shin about to demand more information, or was there something else at play? "We need your help," Shin continued, his expression serious. "I'm not asking you to betray your people, but to share insights that could lead to a different outcome, one that doesn't end in the annihilation of either side." Barley blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. "You're asking for my help to prevent more bloodshed?" Shin nodded. "This war has dragged on for far too long. We've both suffered heavy losses. And for what? Territory, resources, pride. There must be another way." Barley hesitated, his mind racing. Could this be the opportunity he had been waiting for? A chance to broker peace, or at least a truce, between humanity and the Janger. But the risks were enormous. If he made the wrong move, he could end up betraying his own people, or worse, be seen as a traitor by both sides. "I don't know if I can do that," Barley admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm just an engineer. I don't have the authority to negotiate peace." Shin leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You may not have the authority, but you have the knowledge. And knowledge is power, especially in times of war. If you can help us understand your technology, just enough to level the playing field, we can use that information to push for a ceasefire." Barley stared at the captain, weighing his options. On one hand, he could refuse, maintain his loyalty to humanity, and risk being tortured or executed. On the other hand, he could agree to help, potentially saving lives on both sides, but at the cost of aiding the enemy. It was a decision with no easy answers, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Finally, Barley spoke, his voice steady. "I'll help you, Captain Shin, but only on one condition, that you use the information I provide to push for peace, not to gain a military advantage." Shin's expression softened, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Agreed. Let's see if we can find a way out of this war that doesn't involve more senseless death." And so, the unlikely collaboration between human and alien began. Barley found himself navigating a delicate balance, sharing just enough to keep the Janger captain satisfied while carefully guarding the most sensitive aspects of human technology. As they worked together, a mutual respect grew between them, despite the ever-present tension of their conflicting loyalties. But as the days turned into weeks, Barley couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing with fire. The more he revealed, the closer he came to crossing a line he could never uncross. And in the back of his mind, a nagging question remained. Would Captain Shin keep his promise, or was this all just another step in a never-ending cycle of war and betrayal? The breaking point. The collaboration between Michael Barley and Captain Shin was proving to be both fruitful and dangerous. Barley's insights had helped the Janger adapt to some of the new human tactics, allowing them to hold their ground in several key battles. But with each piece of information he shared, Barley felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. How much was too much? When would the line be crossed? One evening, as Barley was reviewing the latest battle reports in his quarters, the door slid open to reveal Captain Shin, his expression grave. Barley's heart sank. Something had gone wrong. "We need to talk," Shin said, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Barley nodded, gesturing for Shin to sit. "What's happened?" Shin took a seat, his eyes locking onto Barley's. "The High Command has ordered a full-scale offensive. They believe they have enough information now to push for a decisive victory." Barley felt a cold chill run down his spine. "But you promised." The breaking point. The collaboration between Michael Barley and Captain Shin was proving to be both fruitful and dangerous. Barley's insights had helped the Janger adapt to some of the new human tactics, allowing them to hold their ground in several key battles. But with each piece of information he shared, Barley felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. How much was too much? When would the line be crossed? One evening, as Barley was reviewing the latest battle reports in his quarters, the door slid open to reveal Captain Shin, his expression grave. Barley's heart sank. Something had gone wrong. "We need to talk," Shin said, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Barley nodded, gesturing for Shin to sit. "What's happened?" Shin took a seat, his eyes locking onto Barley's. "The High Command has ordered a full-scale offensive. They believe they have enough information now to push for a decisive victory." Barley felt a cold chill run down his spine. "But you promised." "I know what I promised," Shin interrupted, his voice pained. "But the decision is out of my hands. The High Command wants to end this war, and they believe this is the only way." Barley's mind raced, panic setting in. He had hoped that by working with Shin, he could influence the Janger to seek peace, or at least a ceasefire. But now it seemed that his efforts had only made the situation more precarious. "You can't go through with this," he pleaded. "If you launch a full-scale offensive, the humans will retaliate with everything they have. It could lead to mutual destruction." The decision. Captain Shin returned to his quarters, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The decision he faced was one of unimaginable consequence, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical burden. If he chose to help Barley, he would be committing an act of treason against his own people. But if he didn't, he knew that the war would escalate to a point of no return, with countless lives lost on both sides. Shin paced the length of his quarters, his thoughts racing. The High Command's orders were clear: launch a full-scale offensive, overwhelm the human fleet, and force their surrender. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Barley was right. The humans wouldn't surrender. They would fight back with everything they had, and the result would be catastrophic. But what could he do? He was just one captain, bound by duty and loyalty to his people. Defying the High Command was unthinkable, yet the thought of following their orders made his frills tighten with anxiety. He couldn't shake the image of Barley's desperate plea from his mind. The human had made a compelling case for peace, but could he really trust him? Shin stopped pacing, his mind latching onto a possibility. There was a way to test Barley's sincerity, a way to see if he truly wanted peace, or if this was all just a ruse to gain an advantage for his people. If Barley was willing to put his own life on the line, then maybe, just maybe, Shin could be convinced to go against his orders. With a resolve born out of desperation, Shin made his way back to Barley's quarters. The human was sitting at his small desk, his face a mask of worry. When he saw Shin enter, he stood up, his expression tense. "Have you made your decision?" Barley asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he was feeling. Shin nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I have. But before I agree to help you, there's something I need to know." Barley's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for Shin to continue. The captain's frills fluttered slightly as he spoke, a sign of the seriousness of his words. "If I'm going to betray my people, I need to be sure that you're not planning to do the same," Shin said, his voice low and steady. "I need to know that you're not just using me to gain an advantage for the human fleet." Barley swallowed hard, understanding the gravity of the question. He knew that his answer could determine not only his own fate, but the fate of millions of others. He took a deep breath and met Shin's gaze with as much sincerity as he could muster. "I swear to you, Captain Shin, that I'm not trying to deceive you," Barley said, his voice firm. "I want to end this war, not just for my people, but for yours as well. I've seen enough death and destruction to last a lifetime, and I don't want to see any more. I'm willing to put my own life on the line to prove that I'm serious." Shin studied Barley for a long moment, his frills twitching as he weighed the human's words. Finally, he nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he heard. "Very well," Shin said quietly. "I'll help you send a message to the human fleet. But know this, Barley. If you betray me, I won't hesitate to end your life myself." Barley nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "I understand, and I promise you won't regret this." Shin turned to leave, but before he did, he paused and looked back at Barley. "One more thing," he said, his tone serious. "If we're going to do this, we need to act quickly. The High Command is expecting the offensive to begin within the next few days. We don't have much time." Barley nodded again, his mind already racing with the logistics of what they needed to do. The next few days would be crucial, and there was no room for error. As Shin left the room, Barley felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time since his capture, he felt that he was finally making a difference. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was the potential reward. An end to the war, and a chance at peace for both humanity and the Janger. The betrayal. The following days were a blur of tension and urgency. Captain Shin and Michael Barley worked in secret, carefully planning how to send a message to the human fleet without alerting the Janger High Command. Every moment was fraught with the possibility of discovery, and the consequences of failure loomed large over both of them. Shin had managed to secure access to an older, less monitored communications array, a relic from earlier in the war that had fallen out of regular use. It was risky, but it was their best shot at getting a message through without raising suspicion. As Barley worked on encrypting the message with codes that only the human fleet would recognize, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was it, their one chance to stop the war from escalating into something that could destroy both sides. The responsibility was almost overwhelming. "We're ready," Barley said, looking up from the console. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. "Once I send this, there's no turning back." Shin nodded, his expression grim. "I understand. Let's do it." With a final deep breath, Barley activated the array and transmitted the message. It was a short, concise plea for negotiations, warning the human fleet of the impending Janger offensive and urging them to consider a ceasefire before it was too late. The message was sent directly to the flagship of the human fleet, where it would be seen by the highest-ranking officers. When the transmission was complete, Barley leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. "It's done," he said quietly. Shin placed a hand on Barley's shoulder, a rare gesture of solidarity. "Now we wait." But the wait was agonizing. Hours passed with no response, and the tension in the air was palpable. Both men knew that if the High Command discovered what they had done, it would be the end for them, if not by execution, then by being thrown into the heart of the battle as cannon fodder. Finally, the console beeped, signaling an incoming transmission. Barley and Shin exchanged a tense glance before Barley opened the channel. "This is Admiral Lucas of the United Earth Fleet," a stern voice came through the speakers. "We've received your message. Who am I speaking to?" Barley hesitated for only a moment before responding. "This is Engineer Michael Barley, currently held aboard a Janger vessel. I'm speaking with Captain Shin, who has agreed to help broker a ceasefire. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the Admiral's voice returned, more measured this time. Captain Shin, can you confirm this? Shin stepped forward, his frills twitching nervously. I can confirm, Admiral. I have disobeyed direct orders from the High Command to initiate a full-scale offensive. Instead, I am seeking to open negotiations for a ceasefire. The silence that followed was deafening. Barley could almost feel the wheels turning in the Admiral's mind as he weighed the situation. Finally, the Admiral spoke again. This is highly irregular, Captain. But if you're sincere, then I'm willing to consider negotiations. However, any further aggression from the Janger fleet, and we will retaliate with full force. Shin nodded, though he knew the Admiral couldn't see it. Understood, Admiral. I will do everything in my power to prevent further hostilities. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Barley and Shin standing in silence. They had done it. They had made contact and opened the door to peace. But the real challenge was just beginning. Shin turned to Barley, his expression one of cautious optimism. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a start. We need to convince the High Command to delay the offensive long enough for negotiations to begin. Barley nodded, knowing that the next step would be even more dangerous. We'll need to tread carefully. If they suspect anything. I know, Shin interrupted, his voice tinged with urgency. But we have to try. If we can buy enough time, maybe we can stop this war from escalating any further. With their plan in motion, Shin and Barley prepared to face the High Command. They would need to present a convincing case for delaying the offensive, one that didn't reveal their true intentions. It was a tightrope walk, and one misstep could spell disaster for both of them. But as they made their way to the command center, neither of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. The walls seemed to close in around them, the weight of their deception pressing down like a vice. When they finally arrived, the atmosphere in the command center was tense. The senior officers of the Janger fleet were gathered around a holographic display, discussing the final preparations for the offensive. All eyes turned to Shin and Barley as they entered. Captain Shin, one of the officers said, his tone sharp. What's the meaning of this? Why have you brought the human here? Shin squared his shoulders, his frills twitching slightly. I have reason to believe that the humans are preparing a counterattack that could devastate our forces. We need more time to gather intelligence before we launch the offensive. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly not convinced. We've been planning this offensive for weeks, another officer said, his voice laced with impatience. Any delay could give the humans time to reinforce their defenses. Barley stepped forward, knowing that this was his moment to make a difference. Captain Shin is right. The human fleet has developed new defensive measures that could severely impact your chances of success. If you rush into this offensive without adequate preparation, you risk losing everything. There was a murmur of dissent among the officers, but Shin held his ground. I'm asking for a brief delay, nothing more. Just enough time to assess the situation and make sure we're not walking into a trap. The officers conferred quietly among themselves, clearly torn between their eagerness to strike and the caution advised by Shin and Barley. Finally, the lead officer turned back to them, his expression hard. Very well, Captain Shin. You have 48 hours to gather the intelligence you need. But if there's no significant development by then, we proceed as planned. Shin bowed slightly, a gesture of deference. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. As they left the command center, Barley let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. We bought ourselves some time, he said quietly. Shin nodded, though his expression remained tense. Yes, but it's not much. We need to make the most of it. For the next 48 hours, Barley and Shin worked tirelessly, coordinating with the human fleet to arrange for a secret meeting between representatives of both sides. The details were shrouded in secrecy, with only a select few aware of the plan. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. The location was a remote, neutral sector of space, far from the prying eyes of the Janger High Command. Both sides sent small, unarmed shuttles to the designated coordinates, with Barley and Shin aboard the Janger shuttle. When they arrived, Barley's heart skipped a beat as he saw the human shuttle waiting for them. This was it, the moment of truth. If this meeting went well, it could mark the beginning of the end of the war. If it went poorly, well, Barley didn't want to think about that. As the two shuttles docked, the air was thick with tension. The representatives from both sides stepped into the neutral meeting space, their expressions a mixture of caution and hope. Shin nodded, his frills fluttering slightly. The feeling is mutual, Admiral. We're here because we believe there's still a chance to avoid further bloodshed. For hours, they talked, discussing the terms of a possible ceasefire and the steps that would need to be taken to ensure a lasting peace. It was a delicate dance, with both sides wary of showing too much weakness or making too many concessions. But slowly, progress was made. By the time the meeting concluded, a tentative agreement had been reached. The ceasefire would begin immediately, with further negotiations to follow in the coming weeks. It wasn't a full peace treaty, but it was a start, a fragile but hopeful first step towards ending the war. As they returned to the Janger shuttle, Barley and Shin exchanged a look of cautious optimism. They had done it. They had managed to stop the offensive and open the door to peace. But they both knew that the hardest part was still to come. "We've taken the first step," Shin said quietly as they prepared to depart. "Now we just have to hope that it holds." Barley nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges they faced were far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. The price of peace. The ceasefire held, but barely. Both sides remained on edge, their weapons ready, their defenses heightened. The peace was fragile, built on the tentative trust that had been forged during that first meeting. But for Michael Barley and Captain Shin, it was a victory, a hard-earned, bittersweet victory. The High Command was not pleased with Shin's actions, but the success of the negotiations made it difficult for them to punish him outright. Instead, they placed him under close watch, restricting his movements and communication. The human fleet, meanwhile, pulled Barley out of the field and brought him back to Earth, where he was celebrated as a hero by some and questioned by others. But for both men, the war had left its mark. Barley found it difficult to adjust to life back on Earth, haunted by the memories of what he had seen and done. He spent his days giving speeches and attending diplomatic meetings, trying to build on the fragile peace that had been established. Shin, too, struggled to find his place in the aftermath of the war. His decision to go against the High Command had cost him dearly, and he was left with a deep sense of unease. The war might be over, but the scars it had left on his people, and on himself, would take much longer to heal. Months passed, and the peace negotiations continued, with slow but steady progress. The ceasefire became more permanent, and plans were made for a formal treaty. But the wounds of war ran deep, and there were still those on both sides who called for retribution, who longed to finish what had been started. Barley and Shin stayed in contact, though their communications were infrequent and closely monitored. They both knew that their work was far from over, that the peace they had fought so hard to secure was still precarious, still at risk of falling apart. One day, as Barley was walking through a park near his home, his communicator buzzed. It was a message from Shin, encrypted and sent through back channels to avoid detection. The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. "The treaty is close, but there are those who will stop at nothing to prevent it. We need to be vigilant. The fight for peace is just beginning." Barley sighed as he read the message, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. He knew Shin was right. Peace was not a destination, but a journey, one that required constant effort and vigilance. He typed a quick response, one that conveyed his agreement and his determination to see this through, no matter the cost. The war had been brutal, and the price of peace was high, but it was a price they had to be willing to pay. As he sent the message, Barley looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. The war might have ended, but the fight for a lasting peace had just begun. And as long as there were people like him, and Shin willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope that the future could be different, that humanity and the Janger could find a way to coexist in a galaxy that had seen far too much bloodshed. Barley turned and began to walk back home, his steps steady, his resolve firm. The path to peace was long and difficult, but it was a path worth walking, and he was determined to see it through to the end.